seeing all of you here, and thanks for coming. I'm going to introduce our distinguished and delightful speaker in a moment, but first I want to welcome all of you and just say a few words about the event. This event serves two purposes. One, it's part of our Mind, Technology, and Society talk series here at UC Merced, and that's a talk series for cognitive and information sciences and other groups on the campus. And incidentally, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary of this talk series tonight. This event also kicks off our wonderful bilingualism workshop, the first one we've had here on the campus, that's dedicated to discussing important issues around how people learn 2 or more languages. And this includes all sorts of issues, cognitive issues, educational issues, social issues, and more. We want to thank all of you for being here tonight, and some of you have come from faraway places like Fresno and Mariposa and so on. Thanks for being here. We also want to express our gratitude to staff members, especially Tricia, for helping us make arrangements for this. And then to AJ Montoya, he's there in the back and he's recording this tonight. Thank you, AJ. We thank the following people and groups for support for this event: the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts, the Center for the Humanities, Psychological Sciences, Cognitive and Information Sciences, and UC Merced's Office of Research. At this point, I'm going to ask my colleagues who have helped me organize this stand up so we can thank them for their hard work. Rose Scott, Eric Wong, Eric Wong, Jeff Gilger, I don't think he's here, Dahlia Mangana, Michael Spivey, who's also an associate. And then myself, I'm Teeny Matlock. Okay, now on to why we're really here tonight, okay? Lily Wong Fillmore is a professor emerita at the University of California, Berkeley, our big sister campus, a couple of hours away. Interestingly, she was also on the task force for UC Merced. So 12, 13, 14, 15 years ago, she was helping other faculty members and administrators decide where UC Merced should be, what kind of campus it should be, and that sort of thing. And tonight when we drove out here, she said she was delighted to see how the campus looked and our vision and so on. So it's just above and beyond what she's going to talk about tonight. It's really nice to have her here for that reason as well. Okay, going back in time a little bit. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Professor Lily Wong Fillmore worked as a volunteer language educator in the farm labor camps. Years later, she obtained her PhD in linguistics from Stanford University, and she went on to become a much valued faculty member in Berkeley School of Education. She grew up in a tiny community in Steinbeck country. That's about two hours west from here, near Salinas in the 1940s. She grew up in a little town that was quite a bit like Merced, even like Merced is now, very diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse area. In some of her writings, she recalls the difficulties of being in a multicultural classroom in the 1940s. For example, she was called a mushmouth by her peers because she had trouble pronouncing English words. And this was because she spoke Cantonese Chinese fluently, and the phonological inventory of that language is radically different from English. And that was her first language, right? In California back then, there was no real interest in preserving one's first language. In fact, it was the opposite. It was all about learn English, this is America. Unfortunately, some of that attitude still persists a little bit. Lily and other people who work in the area, language minority stuff, they try to get around that and do important work that will change people's attitudes and put in place policies and mechanisms that will help young kids maintain their first language, their second language, and multiple languages, and so on. Lily's early passion for language and her early interactions with people from diverse backgrounds over near Salinas set the stage for what would become her career as an adult, where she would do groundbreaking research that has benefited thousands of students at all levels across the country at UC Berkeley, but then also in classrooms in California and other places as well. Very high impact work that will continue to have impact in the decades to come. Over the years, much of her research and teaching has focused on issues around education of language minority students, and we're going to hear all about that in a couple of minutes. She has worked with second language learners from many different backgrounds, including Latino, Asian, American Indian, and Alaska Native. Since retiring from Berkeley about 10 years ago, she continues to work with educators in urban school districts to improve academic language and literacy instruction for English learners and learners of other languages. We're honored to have Lily with us tonight, and we will all walk away from this lecture knowing much more about the challenges of the multilingual classroom and what we can all do to help overcome these challenges and to improve the lives of language users in this part of the state and in other parts of the country. Lily, thank you for being here with us tonight, and thank you for all the important work you've done and will continue to do.
Well, you know, it's been a while since I've been here. I think it was in 1995 or 96 when I was on this big campus, multi-campus committee to think about what we call UC10, and especially appropriate. Today is 10-10, and I am at UC10, yes. So if you're into numerology, it means something. But in those days, you know, as we came out here, and listen, this was what it looked like. This was exactly what it looked like. There was actually one tree when the campus, the system-wide committee came out, and it was a rather sickly looking eucalyptus tree. And the big worry for me was, will they be able to plant trees here? Because there is this hard pan, we were told, which is very close to the surface. So I'm very happy to see that you have done really well. You've done beautifully, and this place is gorgeous. I envy all of you, working here. It must be great excitement to be on the cutting edge of all kinds of fields. We had hoped that the setting would shape the agenda, the research and the teaching agenda here. And we figured that with the natural environment, the location of this area right near the Sierra foothills, and with all of the problems of changing climate conditions and land use and so forth, that somehow this campus would come together and get a vision of education for the next century. And it looks like you're off on a great, great start. So one of the things that we talked about was diversity. You know, we poured over the demographic studies of the area and projections in the future. What would California be like in the future? Because the newest campus had to deal with all those issues. And, you know, diversity was something that I think several of us thought was just about one of the most important things that we could look at, and that the faculty here should be concerned with. Now, California has always been diverse, but its diversity has not always been valued. And that's right from the start, right from the start. This map that you see here is a map of all the indigenous language groups that resided in the state of California at the time of first contact with the Europeans. There were over 100 indigenous languages spoken by a great many native peoples. And I don't know if you know this, but But did you know that California has one of the biggest, no, it has the biggest indigenous populations in the country of all the states? Now, this diversity has been a source of strength in our society, but it has also been one of great conflict. On the one hand, and this is a quote from someone I regard as one of the best ever presidents of the United States, that's Lyndon Johnson. The land flourished because it was fed from so many sources, because it was nourished by so many cultures and traditions, right? But on the other hand, what we have is a kind of meanness, and this isn't just now, it has been from the beginning, all right? And this is Murrieta, not too long ago. So California has been, from the beginning, ambivalent regarding its diversity. And it goes way back at the time of first contact and went into high gear with statehood. There have been nativist movements and xenophobia right from the beginning. My father and mother were deeply affected by all of this. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and then another, that Exclusion Act said no more Chinese people because, it's hard to educate them, and people wondered whether you could ever turn them into Christians. And then there was the Immigration Act in 1924, which closed the door to all peoples from Asia, right? With people saying, we must draw the line somewhere, And then when you consider California's voter referenda over the past 25 years, there's been Proposition 63, which declared English to be the one and only proper language in the state. There was Proposition 187, which would deny any kind of services, health services, education, and so forth, to anyone who was not documented. Happily, that was overturned because the state of California's voters could not make immigration law, so it was overturned. Then there was Proposition 209, which declared no more programs that gave special consideration for underserved groups or for women and so forth. And then finally, Proposition 227, which said no language but English in our public schools. Now, California's population has changed since the 1980s. You take a look at these charts from the California Legislative Analyst's Office, you will see how very greatly things have changed in the 30 years between 1980 and 2010. But the place where this shift is the most evident is in California's schools. And you just take a look at that and you will kind of get a sense of where I'm going with all this. This, of course, is not new information for you. You know that. Right? So, the invitation by Teenie and the committee for me to come to talk to you was one, I was asked if I would talk about my work on language issues related to the education of language minority students and English learners, which I can talk about even if I were asleep and you poked me in the middle of the night, I can do it, okay? No problem. But I don't think that that's the biggest issue these days. There are some more burning issues. So as I thought about what should I talk about, knowing that there would be school people here, knowing that there would be researchers and faculty here, I wondered, what should I talk about? Because I know that with the recent demographic changes, we really need to recognize that the state's future depends on how well we educate all of the state's children well. All of the state's children well. We have not done so well by many groups. Our state, our schools are at a crossroad. So much depends on how we handle the new demographic realities of our state. And the big question is, how prepared are we? How prepared are our schools to address the language and cultural differences in the state's students? This is a big problem for California. There are great disparities in educational outcome for groups. And there have been some improvement over the past few years, but gaps between groups remain constant. And new standards are raising performance expectations. By every single measure, academic achievement, school completion, participation in higher education, and ultimately in jobs and in income, there are huge gaps. The groups that have had the greatest difficulty in our schools have been Hispanics, and English learners in general, 85% of which are Hispanic. African American students and American Indian students. They're not all that visible. They're not all that visible, but they do not thrive in our schools. And so if you take a look at this, and this is a 2013 NAEP, this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a so-called report card for the public schools in the United States. You should know that not every student is tested for these. It's a selection of students, and not from every school, but again, a random selection of schools. And you will see that what the No Child Left Behind law had strived for and practically, broke the backs of our schools, been trying to do is to get everyone fully proficient in reading and in math by 2014. Now, if you take a look at who is at basic and at proficient, what's in the basic is not good enough. Proficient is where you want them to be. Advanced is what parents want their kids to be at. And you will notice that there are some big differences here at the 4th grade. And look at the 8th grade. This is the 8th grade now, and you will see how far many kids are from proficiency in reading, which is, listen, foundational for doing well in high school and beyond. We've got some big problems here. I did these charts just to show you, okay, now, I've got here the groups and the English learners, the ELL is English learners, not ELL are all the kids who are not, and so that's like all the groups of all the kids that are not. Okay, now this is where parents would like their kids to be. This is where No Child Left Behind expected. This is 4th grade reading. Basic is just able to read well enough, sort of, but nothing complicated, nothing demanding, and certainly not good enough. Not good enough. Okay, now, this is the scary part. Check out below basic, and this is really functionally illiterate, okay? All right? That is what I'm working on these days. And this is at the 8th grade now, same thing. How few of anyone is at advanced. Advanced is where the kids should be. Okay, this is proficient, this is for No Child Left Behind. And here are the gaps, how far we've got to go before we are at full proficiency. Okay, that's what I'm worried about. And then from the University of California's accountability report, the distribution of race and ethnic groups of the new undergraduates. Again, some groups are woefully not represented. That's what we're dealing with. It is these differences. These are the guys who are going to go out and be our leaders. Now, I am 80 years old. I am 80 years old. I'm not going to last too long into the future. What comes of our society? I'm not just worried about the state. I'm worried about our society. Where are we headed? All right? So the big question is, what are the causes of these disparities in educational outcome? Is it poverty? Well, it's true. You know, 50% of California students come from low-income families, and we've got a lot of problems. And the disparity in wages, it's just leading to more and more exacerbating the problem. Language, well, nearly 1 in 4 of California's students is an English learner. School and teacher quality, well, again, you know, there's research, and also the judge in Vergara versus California agree that this is a problem for many, many kids. Excuse me. If you look at the schools that kids attend, you know, in poor neighborhoods and in the inner city, schools are poorly equipped to maintain. That's all you can say. And I work in New York, I work in Boston, I work in Denver, I work all over the place, and everywhere this is true. In the poor neighborhoods, you've got poorly equipped schools, you've got poorly equipped schools. The schools in poor neighborhoods look like jails, you know, with chain link fences and so forth. And then you go to the affluent communities, and listen, you know, I don't blame parents at all for bringing in funds, for raising money, for donating their time and services. Who wouldn't? You know, you want your kids to have the best. And so their schools are like the schools we would like all kids to be attending. Now, another possibility is this. These group differences in learning suggest that culture may be an important factor. Now, it's a reasonable assumption, but can lead to some dangerous conclusions about why some groups do not fare well in school. It's almost like a third rail, you know, in educational research. It's really hard to talk about culture. It is just so blasted hard, because the first thing people ask is, well, why are you doing this? Are you kind of a racist or something? You know, see, somehow or another, observations about differences tend to get conflated with prejudices about groups. You know, for example, those kids don't do well in school because their parents don't value education, don't you know? An egregious instance of viewing culture as a risk factor in schooling is Ruby Payne's Culture of Poverty, in which school failure is blamed on stereotypic behaviors of the poor. And listen, that woman has been raking in the big bucks. All over the country, I run into, you know, I bring in a whole crew of people to talk about how terribly depraved and impossible it is to work with those welfare people and the poor, all right? Now, poverty is a condition. It's not a culture. I want you to know that. It is not a culture, and yet it is a problem. It certainly does affect children's lives and their ability to learn. Nutrition has got to be a major, major problem. Housing, the experiences that kids have, the time and attention that parents can devote to child care and to their children. A place for children to study, safety and stability at home. These are big issues, all right, that are affected by income. In a study that's influenced policymakers, Hart and Risley, that's Betty Hart and somebody Risley, whatever his name is, recorded and found so-called meaningful differences in the number of words young children were exposed to in professional, working class, and welfare homes. A 30 million word gap in exposure to words alone, just word counts, all right, by age 3, we are told. This, they claim, was reflected in children's working vocabulary size and ultimately on school outcomes. And by the way, this study, the Hart and Risley work, if you don't know it, has just been tremendously influential in Washington. And the policymakers love this study because I don't know what it tells you exactly, Now, I think, there's also a problem of perspective where differences are seen as deficits. Hart and Risley has been criticized as a blame the victim study, and it's dangerous because it affects how differences are treated in school. So if you know or you believe that there's a 30 million word gap in children's exposure to language, guess what people think? Just guess. What kind of education? They want to get little ones into school, preschool. There's a lot of talk about that. There has been for a number of years. But wouldn't you think that if these kids were so deprived of hearing words that you would surround them with enrichment? Wouldn't you want to just give those kids all the incredible experiences you could? No, that's not what the kids have been getting. They have been getting flashcards, all right? Not talk, but flashcards, as if somehow you can drill 30 million words into the kids' heads by the time they're 5. See, what's awful is that these deficits in experiences are regarded as catastrophic, from which there is no recoverability, and they're intractable, people have been saying, to further experiences in school. See, we have to really think about what all this means. We need, as educators, as parents, we need to be thinking about what kind of remedies. Do they make sense? I know how I can turn education into something that is so boring, so stultifying, that you would never want to go to school at all. And all you gotta do is bring the blasted flashcards out. Why do it to a 3-year-old? Now, the danger, of course, is that suggesting that the disparities in schooling are mostly attributable to student characteristics rather than the way schools function or in the inequality of treatment of some groups. It really is a problem. Jim G. frames the problem this way. What is it about school culture that transforms children who are competent learners at home into incompetent ones at school? This is a question we need to ask. So cultural analysis is a risky undertaking, and yet, and I figured I'm 80, So you don't invite me back again, what the heck, you know? It's hard to dismiss culture as a factor in learning. Consider what children bring to school from the home and family. There are ways of communicating, ways of interacting, ways of participating in the social world of the family and the home, getting and using information. See, these are all a part of one's culture, making sense of and interpreting experiences, and most of all, learning. How do you take from your experiences? How do you take and make your own these experiences that you're having in life, right? This is a part of a person's culture, as I will argue. Now, people are guided. People are guided by implicit learning theories. Who can learn and who can't? For example, there are many cultures that believe that girls shouldn't do whatever, all right? Or that boys shouldn't do this. These are cultural facts, all right? There are people who believe that only people with good musical ears can learn to play an instrument. You gotta have talent. See, these are cultural beliefs too. Attitudes towards variation in capability and alacrity in learning is a part of the implicit belief system that each of us have beliefs about that. Where did you get those beliefs from? What learner characteristics are most valued? What's worth learning? What isn't? The place of understanding in learning. How much do you have to understand before you can learn something? Who decides when a person is ready to learn something new? Mama? The school? Yourself? One's approach to learning. Do you learn things in little itty-bitty bites? Or do you take the whole thing by the middle, you know? Whole enchilada, as it were. Do you learn on your own or with guidance? Who from? Who should be guiding you? The place of practice and persistence in learning, a really big one. Do you practice in private or publicly? By the way, I worked with Alaskan Native kids, and they're a group that likes to do private practice. They don't bore you with their harmonica playing until they just go out in the tundra and they kind of blast away. And then when they're ready to play Home on the Range or whatever, they kind of walk into the village kind of, tweeting away, and everyone says, oh, you can play the harmonica. Right? How much help can a person expect, and from whom? All of these will turn out to be critical. How good is good enough? When do you stop and say, well, I know how to do X? Beliefs about what leads to success in learning. It's really interesting to kind of think about yourself this way and say, oh, where did I get these beliefs? I promise you, each of you, if you start thinking about it, have got some beliefs about all of this, okay? So all of this comes from, this whole big process that anthropologists talk about, which is socialization for learning. It's a big part of one's culture. The question is, how greatly are a family's socialization practices related to a specific culture? Cultural ways of doing things hold up better when a family is in a relatively homogeneous cultural setting. Practices are supported and are more faithfully followed than in a heterogeneous or porous situation. And also, got to keep this in mind too, practices change. For example, when people come into contact with others, there's a lot more variation in immigrants in socialization practices than in the communities they come from. The biggest changes happen in school because the school has got a whole set of these things operating. American school culture sort of reflects American mainstream culture, although it is hardly identical, nor are all schools alike. And also, each teacher walks into the classroom. There is a culture that is a practice we all know about, but the teacher adds his or her element to that too. But overall, similar structures, beliefs, expectations, values, and norms of behavior constitute a distinctive culture, which is different from the cultures of schools in other societies. There have been big studies, multinational studies done of how classrooms are organized for instruction, the kinds of behaviors that the teachers practice, the kind of behaviors expected of students, and so on, and of outcomes, by the way. And just think about American school culture. Now, all I have to do is to remind you that little boys, period, I'm sorry, have a hard time conforming to the cultural expectation, the behavioral expectations of the American classroom, which is very, very much biased towards females. Girls can keep their arms relatively close to their bodies, if you know what I mean, and they're not, they don't have to give a little bit of a kick every time you see somebody pass by that you want to say hello to. You don't have to give little karate chops to people who are bent over water fountains either. Little boys have a hard time dealing with the girl behaviors expected in school. But then think about this too, guys. Think about the horrible problem of boys from certain cultures not doing well in our schools. There are cultures where there is a stronger difference between male behaviors and female behaviors, and it is more important to the boys in some cultures to show that they are not girls early on. And that's going to affect what happens to them in school. And you know how this thing kind of, I just wish that all of us could have a sense of humor about little boys. Actually, I like naughty boys. I really like little spirited guys who do, I've done a lot of observing of boys, which is how I know about the karate chops when you're at the water fountain. But I don't think that we think about this very much. There's very little discussion. I've been going through the literature quite a bit for this talk, and there's not a whole lot of discussion about that. And the one woman, by the way, who has been talking about how the schools are biased against boys, has run up hard against the feminist movement, who argue that she's just dead wrong, that there is no bias against boys. Okay, so I think there is a necessity of considering both school and home cultures in any discussion of culture and learning. A match or congruence between the two makes adjustment to school easier for some. Lack of it makes it more difficult. The question I would like to put into your minds is this: what adjustments can schools make to accommodate students from diverse home backgrounds? Ultimately, we've all got to live in this one big society and together, And everyone has to learn to function, or they don't, in the larger society. But at the very least, coming out of the home, let's cut the kids some slack, you know? Let's think about what kind of adjustments can we make to make school work better for everyone. And so, okay, the big question is, how do you get a purchase on an amorphous problem like this? You know, I'm just throwing a lot of stuff. I don't know, am I making sense to you guys? Now, what I want to do is to share with you a study I did a long, long time ago. One that I have not talked about, one that I have published some little pieces from it, and various other people have gotten dissertations and publications, but the study itself did not get published, all right? And this is my Rip Van Winkle study of second language learning and academic performance, in which culture played a surprising role. Now, this was a largish classroom study that looked at how instructional practices fostered children's acquisition of academic language skills and learning. And this was completed in 1985. Barry McLaughlin at Santa Cruz was a co-PI, as was Paul Ammon. I was the principal investigator of it, all right? And it was a big study, all right? Now, this was not intended as a cross-cultural study. Cross-cultural studies research is never easy to do, because the question that people raise right from the time you draw the proposals, well, what are you trying to show? We were looking at language learning, the learning of English, and at language in learning. Okay, so language learning plus language in learning, which is to say English-only classrooms versus first language support in bilingual classes. And, you know, we were working in several counties, but there was the availability of bilingual classes in Spanish, Cantonese, and some with first language support for Vietnamese kids at that time. The cultural analysis that I'm going to present to you was post hoc. Once we realized that culture was a crucial and, in fact, the most important finding, which was interesting because culture, it was a really good thing that culture has always been something I have been interested in, although I wasn't doing a culture study then. So very briefly, this study. There were schools in urban and rural communities, and there were Asians, and the Asians were Chinese and Vietnamese, and Hispanic, and so they were mostly Mexican, but some Central American students too. We had grades 3 and 5, and in total we had 157 students in 17 classrooms, and there were 19 teachers involved, and several of the classes were team taught. Some classes were in English only, and some were bilingual. The third graders had started school with no English in kinder. And the fifth graders had started school at grade 3 with no English, which is why we had that unusual number of kids, because to meet those conditions was, you know, something that wasn't easy to do. Although the subjects all had had 3 years of English in school, there was a great variation among them in English proficiency at the start of the study. Some kids knew quite a lot, they were almost fluent, and some kids were just getting started. So these were the questions, these were the official questions that we were investigating. What instructional practices foster children's acquisition of language and literacy skills and academic learning, okay? And then what student characteristics interact with instructional practices to affect the acquisition of second language skills and learning. The methods, well, we just looked, we hunted high and low, found the most tedious ones we could find. We tested, observed, documented minutely the children's language and literacy learning behavior over the course of a year. We put little backpacks on the kids, and now you could just give them a little handheld, a wrist thing, but in those days it was a little tape recorder and little backpacks that the kids wore. And we had tests of reading, our own tests of reading, writing, oral language production and comprehension. And we had achievement scores from district and state mandated tests. We also did real-time observations of the children's learning behavior in various activities over the course of the school year, together with audio recordings of those events. But the most important observations were focused on instructional events that took place in the classroom, which captured student and teacher behaviors as well as other aspects of the classroom environment. And those were full-day video observations in the classroom. So it was just a huge, huge job documenting instructional practices. 4 full days of video recorded observations in each of our 17 classrooms allowed us to study closely and do ratings on the classroom environment, for example. And this was the noise level, activity structure, grouping practices, the clarity of event boundaries. You know, some places you could tell when reading was over and the next thing started. Sometimes they just kind of blended right together. And we didn't know whether that would be important, but we thought, well, you know, okay. Instructional focus, what was the teachers getting at? The opportunities for students to interact with one another and with teachers and so on. And then there was the instructional language, and this was the use of the children's first language, Cantonese or Spanish, and English, the second language, by teachers. And what we were looking at was clarity and structural transparency of instructional language. How clear were the teachers in offering instruction on whatever they were teaching? Were they making appropriate adjustments for the sake of the kids? Were they just talking, or were they kind of adjusting when the child seemed not to understand? Did they go back? Did they paraphrase? Did they say the thing, do the thing over again some other way? Calling attention to the language in the course of using it, which from my other studies on second language acquisition seemed to be very, very important. You know, you call attention to the fact that you are saying something, you're repeating something, and so forth. The learner focuses in on what it is that you have sort of bracketed, as it were. Opportunities for student verbal practice also. Now, there were 4 big clusters of variables that turned out to be really critically related to academic language and learning outcomes. The first was what we ended up calling quality of teaching. And that had to do with all of these factors, how the classes were structured, how clear it was to the kids, what was expected of them, and so forth, all right? Quality of the learning environment, which was interesting because in some there was so much movement, that it was sometimes hard to concentrate on what was happening or to focus in on just what is it I'm supposed to be paying attention to. Sometimes there was so much noise that it was hard to know what was going on. Also, there were acoustical problems in some of the classroom areas. There were some where the large space broken up into modules, open on the top, you could hear everything from all the other modules, but you couldn't hear what was going on 5 feet from you. And so we would have to really, really focus to fit when, especially in a videotape, things get flattened out, right? Quality of the instructional language, and that had to do with modifications and clarity and so forth, adjustments made for the sake of the learners, clarity of what was being commented on, and so on. And then finally, opportunities to practice the second language with peers and with teachers. And there were complex interactions with 2 types of learner variables. Initial proficiency in English, as I said, although they were all kids who had had 3 years of exposure to English, there were differences in their initial proficiency, and that turned out to be important. But also ethnic and cultural group, Asian versus Hispanic. Program type, and that is bilingual versus English only, and age at first contact with English, 5 or 6 versus 7 or 8, turned out not to be significant at all, not to be significant differences. And there were really confusing initial findings. There were no great differences between the 2 groups in how much progress was made in language learning overall. But there were in academic outcomes. Get that? Academic outcomes were strongly related to classroom scores on all of our summary variables for Hispanic students, but not for the Asians. Academic outcomes were pretty much the same for the Asian students, irrespective of how the classrooms were rated in quality of instruction, quality of instructional language, and interactional opportunities. The only summary variable that seemed to be at all related was the quality of the learning environment. That's noise level, organization, etc., but not strongly. So, the big question for me was, gosh, what's going on? And so we're looking at, then we had to look at how culture can influence language and academic development in the second language. It was only when we started looking at how aspects of these variables related to performance for the 2 groups that we could see what was going on. The Latino kids performed abysmally in classes where instruction was confusing, unclear, or poorly executed. They did appallingly poorly when the instruction was really, really poor. The Hispanic kids, it seemed, needed to understand what they were working on. They were taught in English mostly, even in the bilingual classes. Everything was okay as long as they could figure out what they were supposed to be learning. What they were supposed to be learning. For the Hispanic students, reading instruction in English was especially problematic. They were learning to decode but had a hard time understanding the text that they were working on. Not that it mattered much, because the texts were just these appallingly simplified texts, so there wasn't much to understand, even if they could read them and understand them. There was nothing to get from them. They seemed to believe that reading was something that was done in school but did not really mean anything. The Hispanic children in the bilingual classes generally did better than the ones in the English-only classes, but only if their teachers provided access to text meaning in Spanish. If they didn't, they were in the same boat. So, this really argues for native language instruction for the kids. The Hispanic kids shone, they sparkled when there were opportunities and the freedom to interact and work with peers. and this was especially important for making academic progress. The children helped one another, they collaborated in figuring out what things meant, and their English developed rapidly when there were peer-age speakers and they were not constrained from working with them. See, there are situations where teachers say, just do your work, don't talk to each other. Well, it doesn't really help them at all if they can't talk to each other if it's important to them to discuss and figure out what things mean, right? They profited from working with teachers too, and from participation in formal lessons when the lessons were well planned, especially when there were many opportunities to participate verbally. They were especially helped when the materials made sense to them, when the language barrier was lowered by teachers providing many ways for them to gain access to meaning. It's just not that they couldn't learn. They had to have certain conditions for learning. In contrast, the Asian kids had difficulty working with English-speaking classmates until they achieved at least an intermediate level of proficiency in English. They just didn't want to talk with one another. Just figured, I'm not going to get anything from you. You're just a student, all right? They much preferred the safety of working with their teachers and profited from opportunities to interact with them in structured settings and from the feedback that teachers provided. They were, however, hampered by classroom noise and confusion that made it difficult for them to track what was being said by their teachers. They liked a kind of, well, you know what I mean. So, it was quite a bit of turmoil until I found, okay, I gotta go back to those blasted videos, those 4 days of 17 classrooms. I need to look at what's going on. And what the video showed was this. When things were unclear, when there were muddled Chinese teachers, as there are muddled every other kind of teachers. If the teachers were unclear, if it wasn't clear at all what the teacher wanted the kids to learn, the Asian kids kind of leaned forward, and they would, like 2 inches more, and maybe I will make better sense of what this person wants me to learn. It was really an astonishing thing. You could just see them kind of leaning forward. The more noise there was, the harder they would squint their eyes, everything, right? The Asian kids, this is really important, did not seem to be hampered by not understanding what they were learning. They plugged on, they persevered, they worked even harder where they could make no sense of what they were working on. Okay, now I'm going to tell you some more, but this is why I Van Winkled the study, all right? The findings in group differences in learning was this. If we really believe that the capacity to learn is distributed across groups as well as within groups, and I got it from God himself, he told me that. Then we have to ask, what's going on and what can we do about it? What can we do about all of this? But this was the 1980s. Remember, we completed this thing in 1985. And there were the cultural wars going on. This was before many of you were born. But in the universities, the student campaign to broaden the curriculum to include non-mainstream groups was going on. There were huge demonstrations and stuff going on at Stanford, Berkeley, Ann Arbor, Madison, Los Angeles, and so on. And the big question is, what is American culture? Culture became an uncomfortable and thus forbidden topic. And I got orders from on high, meaning from Washington, D.C., from the funding agency, Culture was not to be mentioned in any of her reports. I had to scrub that. I said, well, what am I going to use? I said, well, think of something. You can't use the word culture. And all I could say was, just give me a break. I'm just too old for this. So, I have spent my years in between then and ever since, ever since, and even before, looking at culture, looking at the socialization of children for learning, which is in the most important thing, the curriculum of the home and family. So let's look more closely at how these and other cultural groups socialize their children to learn and consider what facilitates or inhibits learning at school, given children's cultural inclinations. Okay, now parents teach their children how to communicate and to learn during the socialization process, as well as ways of behaving, seeing, and thinking that will enable them to function smoothly and effectively in the world of the home and the primary community. The practices and beliefs that guide the socialization process are part of the culture itself. Members of the community know what to do, although few can actually say what it is that they do is culturally specific. We all know what we do, but we don't think of it as being a part of what we got from our parents and from their parents before them. So, let me tell you how it happens. And I'm going to start with the culture I know best with many caveats. As you all know, I am a lifelong Chinese person. First, culture is neither monolithic or deterministic. There is variation within any group. And Chinese kids are not all alike, no more than Asian people are all alike. There are some interesting pan-Asian similarities across groups, however. Similarly, when I discuss Mexican socialization practices, there is variation among them related to assimilation, social class differences, regional differences, and the continuum between European and indigenous cultural influences in the Mexican population. There is considerable variation across Hispanics overall. Socialization practices and beliefs are not practiced exclusively by any one group, but can be shared. And the configuration of characteristics is the big thing here. And also, people change because times change, circumstances change, and people adapt. My children did not socialize their children in the way that I socialize them. They turned to books, if you can believe it. And I certainly did not socialize my children the way my mother socialized, my parents socialized me, because I knew better, all right? But let's go to traditional Chinese socialization practice. I wonder if you guys can guess what's happening in that photograph. Take a guess. A wild one. This is an infant, what, 9 months? She's potty training them. Yes, because it doesn't matter, you know, we're not talking about psychology and all that stuff. We're not talking about universals of child development. We're talking about culture. And Chinese people believe that their kids ought to be toilet trained as early as possible, do or die. Do or die. 9 months. No more messy panties. All right? So she's holding them over a potty and she's making little pee-pee noises and hoping that the kid will get inspired. Parents Chinese parents view the proper rearing of children their most important mission and their greatest responsibility, because that's how their adequacy as parents and human beings will be judged. Infants are seen as promising protoplasm, which is going to require a lot of parental guidance and instruction to mold into a proper, well-functioning person. And that's like toilet training. 9 months. How do I know all of these things? I lived with my late former ex-mother-in-law, who was constantly, when my children were young, instructing me, that kid should not be messing in his pants anymore. I said, well, you work on it. No, if you're a good mother, you would know, blah, 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 you know. When a mother deems her child is ready, she gives him or her little tasks and then teaches the child to do them properly and well. Never any more than the child can handle. Bring me a diaper. Bring me a diaper. No, you put your hand underneath it, you pick it up, so otherwise it's going to get all messed up. I don't want to have to fold it again. Those were the old days when you still had cloth diapers. And so little by little, coach, it's a lot of jawboning, jawboning into perfection. The Chinese, but there are huge similarities across Asian groups. I've had Vietnamese tell people, oh, no, that's Vietnamese. Koreans say, no, that's Korean, and so forth, all right? Parents provide instruction, monitoring, modeling, and correcting. The child is encouraged to practice and to improve performance until you are as good as an adult might be at this little itty-bitty piece of a performance. When the child is able to do the task, whatever it happens to be, very, very well, the parent rewards him or her by giving another task to learn from, and the process is repeated. Instruction is focused on performance. Explanations are offered only in terms of why doing something one way is better than the other. No explanation as to how this task relates to the larger scheme of things. God, I wish we had a lot of time, because have I got stories for you? No praise? Well, lots of groups. No praise. Seems like nobody gives anybody any praise, except for American mainstream, which is, oh, Jason, you just walked across the room without falling, and you're only 18. Good job. Doing as well as possible is expected of everyone, so there's no need to praise anyone at all. And there are traditional, which is parental roles. All bets are off now. But the mother's role is that of teacher and enforcer in the socialization of children in the Chinese family, and she does this with endless aphorisms. And this is one of the reasons why I've gotten along well with Mexican cultures, because there are the consejos, and it's very similar. She's the parent who makes sure the children will be a credit to and not a drag on the family stock. Father is the deus ex machina, the one who raises the discourse to a higher level and teaches the big lessons in life. Father's lessons are told as gusi, stories to guide children into ethical values and cultural understandings that are foundational to civic life. When I was growing up, my father would say, he would call me over, he said, I have a goosey for you. I thought, oh, rats, what the hell have I done now? Already I'm examining all of the bad thoughts, the meannesses, the little jealousies and stuff. And then he was talking, there was once the poet Li Po was walking through, it was always Li Po, I didn't know why poor old Li Po got dragged through the mud like this. But it was always Li Po who did something, and then the stories would never have any resolution. There was never any convenient way for me to tell, what the heck did I do? I brought that on. And then the next 2 weeks, I was, oh God, I wonder what was on. It must have been, no, couldn't have been. He wouldn't have known about that, you know. But at any rate, it worked terribly well. The messages Chinese children are given about learning Chinese, parents and teachers. And listen, does this sound like good stuff for, for us in schools? Huh? Parents and teachers know when you're ready to learn something new, and you should not question their judgment. They teach you when you are ready to learn, by God. No such thing as individual differences. Anyone can do anything. Remember what I mentioned in that little list of those things that guide us, you know, these little beliefs about teaching and learning? Okay, guess this, no such thing as individual differences. Anyone can do anything, which is to say there is no such thing as can't. Learning is just a question of effort and diligence. Now, I have a mentally retarded niece, and my mother would tell me, you know, you're always making excuses for her. I would say, yeah, well, you know, she can't do what you're asking her to do. She said, well, if you didn't make excuses for her and just let me have at her, she said she would be, you were retarded too, she said. You gotta have your wits about you if you have a Chinese mother. You do not need to understand why or what things mean. Just learn it. What do you need to understand for it? Everything will come together when you are ready. To master any skill, you must learn sub-skills first. And the message you get is this: master the techniques first, then the repertory. Only then are you qualified to think about creativity. And Chinese, I took lessons in Chinese brush painting. I've known people who have taken music lessons in Chinese. No such thing as creativity. That's why I'm not creative, you know. But you know, it works well enough for Chinese people, because learning to read and write Chinese is not for the faint-hearted. You gotta start. I mean, you know, you gotta think about the world in terms of direction and which comes first, which direction things go in, the stroke order, stroke direction. All of these things are absolutely critical to learning to write beautiful Chinese. Okay, now I have a friend, Joyce Tang, who was at the University of Wisconsin, and she took her kids to Beijing not a few years ago, and decided to put them in the Chinese schools. And at those schools, the children were taught to read Chinese by rote memorization of long texts, Confucian Analects, and poems by long, very dead Chinese poets. And she argued with the teacher, saying, well, that's not the way we Americans do things. And she was told, it does not matter whether your daughter understands or not. She has to memorize the repertory first, and then when she's ready to understand, it's all going to be in her head, waiting for her. Okay? That, I submit, is different. And the keys to success, according to the Chinese, is diligence, maximum effort and commitment. Competition is very important and necessary, since excelling is everything. But it is nothing, absolutely nothing. Whatever you do, however well you do, you must not gloat. It's kind of hard sometimes. Humility is essential, since social harmony must be maintained above all. See, there's some really interesting things going on in the heads of the Asian students who are reared in this way, all right? So, another culture I know, which is Mexican culture, been around it since I was about 7 years old when I was put at a non-English speakers table, which I didn't know it was a non-English speakers table. There were a couple of other Chinese kids and were Mexican kids. Only I didn't know they were Mexican. I didn't know they weren't speaking English. So I got to know them real well. But Guadalupe Valdez knows much, much better about the socialization of children for learning in Mexican families. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but if you aren't, you should read it. It's very interesting. Con Respeto, Bridging the Distance Between Families and Children, Families and Schools. And she did her work in a border community in New Mexico. And the culture and the cultural patterns that she got were, people were mestizos, but both of us figure that they're probably more indigenous than Hispano. In the Mexican families that Guadalupe studied, the children are not the focus of the family's energy. The family is. It's not, the children are part of the family, but the family unit is at the heart of everything. The primary goal of the family, which is to say the extended rather than the nuclear family, is family-centric. And the most important source of knowledge and work and support is the family network. Infants are enveloped in loving attention. They are everyone's responsibility. And little tiny kids are calling tinier ones mijito and mijita, my little daughter, my little son, Much attention is given to early development, and each new skill and learning is noted, and the toddler is asked to display la nueva gracia for the entire family. Show them, go on, sing, and so on. That is up to age 3. After that, the focus is back on the family. Children are included in all family activities and are encouraged to observe what is happening and to participate when they feel they are ready to do so. When they feel they are ready to do so. None of this holding a kid over a pot at 9 months and making little pee-pee noises, all right? Little explicit instruction or guidance is given, although the little ones are afforded front row seats in all activities, privileged places to observe the work and activities of the family. They learn through focused observations. Barbara Rogoff's work at Santa Cruz documented in Mexico these processes, and also peripheral participation. Jean Lave and Etienne Wanger's work documents that kind of process. This is going on in the home. The most important guides to learning are older siblings and cousins. Children learn by doing. When a child thinks he or she is ready, which is to say, understands what is to be done, and understands the goal of the activity, an older sibling, usually, or adult, shows him or her the ropes. The important thing here is that the child decides when to begin. And what triggers that understanding, that decision, is understanding what is happening and why you are doing what you're doing. There is a prevalent belief in age-appropriate undertakings. Children learn through observations, and when they are ready, they try things out. Does that suggest that maybe we ought to structure things a little bit differently than we do in our schools? Imperfect early efforts are expected and tolerated, but they usually elicit suggestions for improvement or demonstrations, but no explanations. Children can ask questions which are answered, but there is no attempt to get the child to think about the process or to understand it. the assumption is that the child will figure it out. See, I'm not saying that all of these things should be kept absolutely intact. You do want kids to start thinking about things. So, there is the bigger question of what do you do to accommodate these differences, and what are you going to have to do to get kids to do more and more and more, the kind of thinking, reasoning, and so forth that we want kids to learn in school, right? And children are given time to grow into tasks, to grow into them. There is a recognition of and respect for individual differences. What's expected of children is influenced by judgments of their character or temperaments. Children are often characterized in terms of personality traits or their potential in learning. Some are regarded as listos, or clever or intelligent, while others are said to be cerrado de cabeza, closed-minded. Learning by plugging on is not regarded as real learning. A person who does this is characterized as a machetero, a plugger, plodder. Guadalupe says there is a profound belief that all people are good at doing certain things and not others. The secret of life is to find out what you're good at and do it just as well as you possibly can. The mother's role in socialization, and this is really a big difference than what we think, what the schools expect. We expect mothers to be helping with homework, to be teaching the ABCs at home before the kids get to school, etc., etc. But that's not the mother's role. Her role is the moral upbringing of children. Respeto is the key value. Teaching children their responsibility and obligation to put the family first, respecting the rights of others, not demanding undue attention. Excuse me. Sorry about that. See, when we talk about what parents should be doing, we need to understand what parents are doing, The main teaching tool, and these are the consejos, spontaneous homilies, stories tailored to the child's age and need for moral guidance by mother. The main strategy, teaching strategy, are appeals de respeto. The mother's main goal in socialization is to educate the children. Being bien educado refers to moral upbringing, not book learning, but moral upbringing. Listen, I've spent the last 11 years working with a family, being very close. They're family now. And I have seen this over the course of time, and parents are just constantly working with their children's responsibilities as humans, I would trust any one of those kids with my life, and I do. With anything I have, I trust them more than I do a whole lot of other people, because I know they are well educated. I've seen it happening. The father's role in socialization is interesting. Officially and traditionally, father plays a less direct role in the socialization of children. Now this changes. Danny, this changes. He's going to be a father soon. His main responsibility is economic. Mother is the parent who is in charge of the moral upbringing of the children and who deals with matters pertaining to schooling. Father is the one who steps in when the situation calls for serious enforcement of rules to maintain the integrity of the family. So father's role is chief role model and also chief lecturer, as far as I could tell. And the messages children are given about learning are these: observe and you'll understand how things are done and learn how to do them too. When you think you're ready to take up a task, go for it. If you need help, someone will show you how it's done. Count on the help and support of family, and by extension, your friends. The most important source of knowledge is experience. See, there's nothing wrong with this. There is nothing darn wrong with it, except that we misread all the things that these kids bring to school. How could we be so far off? How could we be so far off, I ask you? A person's temperament and particular talents are what they are. Learn to play the hand of cards you receive. Be content with what you are, and what you can do real well, okay? The success of the family is what matters, not individual success. Does this sound familiar to you guys? So how does this play out in our schools? The children in a diverse society like ours come from many different social and cultural milieux. Unfortunately, such differences can lead to some misperceptions about children's capabilities. For example, Chinese children are generally viewed by teachers as good and even model students, hardworking, dedicated, and smart, whether or not they are. You know, they're doing well, but there are as many not so incredibly intelligent Chinese as there are any other group, right? Mexican children are often viewed as less promising students, even when they are equally hardworking, dedicated, and smart. Because of these perceptions, Mexican children do not get the same degree of supportive instruction that the Chinese children do. The resources that children bring from home are critical to learning. Once we understand the rules children are operating with, it's easier to build on those resources. The point here is we need to recognize, we need to understand what children are bringing to school. We can do that by learning about the child rearing and socialization practices of the groups in our communities. Otherwise, we work at cross purposes with the home and the family. When that happens, it becomes more difficult for children to learn. We can turn them off. We can turn them off. For example, what happens when children who have a need to understand what they are learning decide that the texts they are reading at school do not mean much or have any relevance to their real lives? What if they decide they have no talent for learning at school? Sadly, that's why many, many, many children give up on themselves. The ones I showed you, represented by those charts, you know, they're still in school. They haven't given up on it yet. There are so many implications for school practice and for research. Just wish we had lots and lots and lots of time. I would love to talk with you now. I'd like to hear what you think about these issues. There are implications for research here. There are for school practice. Thank you.